Today we're going to talk about working with JSON objects in Node-RED. JSON objects today are used universally in IoT, and is something that everybody should understand. It is very simple to work with JSON objects in Node-RED. In this video, we will go through a few simple cases. So let's first start with a inject node, which allows you to define a object of different types to inject. Let's say we inject a number, 25. Let's use this one to represent a sensor source, say a temperature sensor that outputs some temperature number. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at what is the data structure coming out of this inject node here. So if I just connect it to a debug node and deploy, let's see what happens. So this is the first very simple thing that we're going to do. So if I click here, you're going to see that, message.payload is the number 25. So by using the debug node by default, it gives you this property called message.payload. Let's do something a little bit different. Let's go to, instead of just showing message.payload, let's show the complete message object. So that would be the complete object that comes from the inject node and goes into the debug node. So now let's deploy. And if I click on the inject node, give me 1 second. If I click on the inject node, I did that twice. So let's look at it. Now, all of a sudden, it has 3 different properties instead of just the payload. So you can see that the message object has a message ID. This is a random ID that originates from the first node, but then it gets carried through across all the nodes in its path. Often you don't need to use this ID here. And it shows you the payload, which is 25. And it shows you this extra other property called topic. So you can see that here, there's actually an option for you to set a topic. Let's say if we get rid of that and do a deploy, you'll see that the topic property goes away. So you can see that there's only the message ID and the payload here. So fundamentally, the message object gets passed from one node to the next node to the next node. And the payload property of the message object is typically the data, right? So when you have a sensor that gives you a raw number, typically you have to work with that sensor number. So the node that you wanted to use to format the sensor data is change node. This is probably the most popular, most useful node in my opinion. So let's give it a name, call it formatting the data. And let's say that we wanted to change the payload from Celsius to Fahrenheit. And to do that, to do some math, we have to use this particular thing called Jsonata. It's not too complicated. If you wanted to look at its documentation, you can see that it's a very powerful query language on the JSON object. But for now, we can just do simple math. Let's say we wanted to convert the payload object, to Fahrenheit, which is you multiply by 9, you divide by 5, you add 32. So now you can convert this to Fahrenheit. Say done, deploy. And if we click on it, you can see that now the payload is 77. Typically, also what you want to do is you wanted to add another field, maybe called message.timestamp. because you wanted to know the time at which you got this data, and you can easily just set the timestamp to the timestamp object, and now you have a timestamp. And typically, I always like to put the timestamp as the first property, because you want to set the time as early as possible before you process other things. Maybe we can add another property called message.type, and that would be the type of the sensor. So we can just set it to a string temperature. Okay. And now another thing that we can set is maybe some kind of alert, right? So let's say, again, here we need some conditional statement. Let's use a Jsonata object again. So what we can do is we can say if the payload is greater than, say, 20 degrees, okay? Then this is the Jsonata syntax. Then we set message.alert to be alert, okay? Something like that. Let's try this out. Done. Deploy. Let me also clear the debug panel so we have more room here. So now I'm going to click on that. We can see we have a bunch of more properties here. So the payload is 77. That's the temperature in Fahrenheit. Timestamp. This is the Unix time. And the type is temperature. Alert. Basically, now you have alert, right? So one other thing that we can do here is you can also add almost like a if then else statement. No alert. Obviously, you're not going to do this in reality, but you could add a no alert here. So which means that if the payload is less than 20, then message.alert is set to no alert. This is not going to change the answer because the temperature is 25, so it's greater than 20. But you can do a if then else in Jsonata. So this is a very basic tutorial here. The goal is to show you how to take some data, format it into a JSON format, and then output it to display in the debug panel. You can obviously do more complicated stuff. Actually, maybe here we can do something like that. So instead of just the 25, what we can do is we can maybe set it to a more complex JSON object that includes both the temperature in Celsius and the temperature in Fahrenheit. So let's do this. So what we can do is we'll set a message.temp. You'll see what we do here in a minute. So let's say message.temp. Let's call it .tempc is message.payload. Okay. And let's add another field, message.f is the Fahrenheit, right? So payload times 9/5 32. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move this up to here, move this one up to here. We're going to remove this because we're not, going to change the payload here anymore. So now what we want to do is we wanted to set a payload. So let's do move. What move does is it'll delete the object that you you moved from. So we moved message.temp to message.payload. Okay. So this is a little bit convoluted here, but basically all we're doing is we're defining a temp object, which actually has two different properties. One of them is called tempc, which is set to the current message.payload. And then we have another object called tempf, which is set to the Fahrenheit conversion. And then we basically move the temp object into the payload object. So the temp object gets deleted after this operation here. So the question you may ask is, why didn't we directly set a tempc and tempf object in payload? The reason is the payload that comes from this property here is a integer. You cannot set a integer dot property, right? Because the integer is a type by itself. An integer cannot be converted to a JSON object itself. So you have what we're doing here is we created a temp object that's a JSON object, but eventually we can move the temp object into payload. So that's how this works. So let's take a look at the answer here after we do a deploy. So now, if we click on the, oops, looks like I made a mistake. Right. So what it's complaining is that it's complaining to me that the alert statement is no longer working because the payload is no longer a number. It is now actually a JSON object. And what I want is I wanted to look at the payload.tempc. This is the property I wanted to evaluate against the number 20. So once I do that, this should work. So let's do a deploy. And now let's see what we got here. So you can see that payload is no longer a number like before, it's object. So you have to click in to see inside payload, there's two properties, tempc and tempf. And you can see that the alert works correctly because we changed, from payload to payload.tempc. So obviously you can create very complex data structures inside Node-RED. And this is why it is so powerful and so flexible to work with any kind of data. Thank you.